going back to our list too, like, because so Owen and I and our other co-hosts on our show have done episodes on some of these thinkers. And we have done episodes on Derrida and on Foucault. And like, I go back and forth on the extent to which I understand them as being postmodern in like the relevant sense, or even in like a non-caricatured sense.
Yeah, we should probably just say quickly that none of these people call themselves postmodern or would identify with that. You know,
and most of them explicitly reject being called Marxists.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I mean, who's the? I mean, I'm trying to think. Like, I mean, I guess McKinnon, in a very stupid way, I know what he means with about the neo-Marxist part, because she has things where she'll say like her understanding, like she has moves that'll be like feminist versions of things that are explicitly modeled on, right, Marxist ideas, which is not to say that she's a Marxist, right, but like that she sees a structural analogy between what Marxists are saying and what she's saying. I have no idea in what sense he thinks that the author of Points Against Postmodernism is a postmodernist. Like that I don't get at all.
Right.
But like other than that, right?
I mean the Foucault. The funny thing for me about the Foucault inclusion is like I wrote my dissertation in part on Foucault, and I tried like super hard to squeeze every possible Marxist like bit of Marxism out of Foucault I could possibly find. I don't know how successful it ultimately was at the end, trying to make him more Marxist than he at least comes. It's really hard. I mean, first of all, you have to get over all of the claims he makes where he says, he rejects class as an explanatory like principle, where he rejects the notion of like, revolution, or where he doesn't, he rejects the agency of workers' struggles. Like you have to get past all of that. And then to figure, okay, like what, there's a brief period in his work there where there is some overlap with some Marxist problematics, but I just find it funny
early 1970s,
early 1970s, where he's in kind of post 68 atmosphere where the ideas of Althusser are prominent and all that. But yeah, the idea that you can just like that you just lump him in there is, I don't know, I find.
The milieu, like the context was important too. A lot of folks in the French scene, and this is super the case for Foucault, is responding to the kind of structural, organizational, and ideological failures of the PCF, the French Communist Party at the time, which in the middle of the 20th century was just like outright Stalinist, right? And so when in interviews through the 70s, he's like, no, I'm not a Marxist. He means like, I'm not those assholes, right? Quite specifically. But at the same time, like the mode of analysis that he elaborates is not Marxist in so many ways. And it's very difficult, like you said, Owen, even to figure out how you would coordinate these things, how you'd bring them into sort of articulation with one another.
Yeah, I mean, I guess sure. Early 70s Foucault, like you watch his debate with Noam Chomsky. I mean, like he says things that are like, in terms of political conclusions, right, sound like very, I don't know, like Maoist even, right? Like, but even in that debate, right? I mean, if you actually listen to anything that he's saying, like theoretically, like none of it is really Marxist in any way, right? Like. And I guess I don't really know on this, like, okay, so I mean, you mentioned, Naomi Klein earlier, who I think is a like good, honorable social democrat.
100%. And one who's very clear about the nature of the problem being specifically capitalist forms of social organization.
And who just sorry.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, and who just does like incredible work synthesizing empirical research.
Yeah,
right, which is something that I guess a postmodernist wouldn't really find a postmodernist doing, right? Like her books all gather like an insane amount of data and information and studies, like her climate book especially. But
no, I'm teaching her climate book this week actually, and it's like one of the best pieces of like politically motivated journalism to have come out in the past like half decade, I think. But even so, pretty clearly not a Marxist. She never uses Marxist categories. I know that in interviews she's identified herself as a non-Marxist. So yeah, like you said, like this is a clear-cut case. This one's solved, right? A good social democrat.
No, exactly, right? Which is like a fine thing to be. Way, like totally. And you know, conjecturally, like, is a great thing to me, right? But like in
100%.
but also, yes, not a Marxist, and doesn't seem to be a postmodernist, and doesn't seem to have much of anything to do with either of these things. Never mind sit at the nexus between them or whatever fucking it's supposed to be. So let's see. Judith Butler with, you know, I mean,
not a Marxist.
I mean, yeah, a post-structuralist of sorts, especially
definitely
in the earlier works, but
yeah, I mean, most famous, of course, for like her theory of gender performativity, which we can understand as like a post-structuralist intervention into debates that were being had about femininity in the late 80s and early 90s, which has been very influential and has nothing to do with Marx or Marxism. She almost never talks about Marx or Marxism. And I think the worry, actually, I think about Butler and Foucault being quite similar here insofar as I think they both have a lot of really good insights. I think that they have a lot of really good and important work, but that like there is a tendency to sort of relapse into a kind of, I want to say like defeatist liberal politics, a kind of very, you know, anti-revolutionary, small scale kind of way of thinking about what transformative political practice looks like. I'm always on the pod making fun of Foucault for his last couple books being just like, check out these gymnastics diaries that the Romans had. And it's like, what are you, Michel, we have problems to solve, my dude. Like, you've lost the thread, I think. And like, these are the second and third volumes of the history of sexuality. The first of which was probably the most influential book of his in the American or Anglo-American scene, where again, like, show me anything remotely Marxian about the analysis in that book, which is about how like the injunction to tell stories about your sexuality gives you the sense that you have an inner truth called your sexuality, and this is like a form of power being exercised over you in this confessional scene like that. I mean, where are the relations of production? What are we talking about? You know?
I mean, and with Butler, I guess I can see why Butler would be one of his enemies in a sense, and especially the early work in Gender Trouble, where she takes on the sex gender distinction, right? The idea that, well, gender is maybe socially constructed, but sex is something that's like biologically essential and real. And she says, well, actually, sex also, or our knowledge of sex itself, also has a history. And again, the charitable way of reading it is that we have knowledge of sex that is mediated through. It isn't just immediate knowledge of biological essence, right? But that biological knowledge even of sex is also mediated through power dynamics and social structures and ideologies. So
yeah, the like I can see why that's the one sentence upshot of which is that like sex is always already gendered too, right?
It's already gendered too,
right. Which again, like,
which I can see how like, someone like Jordan Peterson.
That's where Marx lands at the end of the chapter on the working day.
That's so true. That's so true. I remember it's in volume. I thought it was in volume 3, right, where he's talking about the law of the rate of the tendency of profit to fall. He's just like, also listen, sex always already gendered, folks. You want to jot that down, and maybe you can work on your microaggressions. You know, do a couple of land back statements.
I also want to point out, like,
acknowledgements.
Okay, exactly. Yeah. If so Foucault, if like the best case for thinking that Foucault somehow has something to do with Marxism is that like in like early 70s Foucault like had like sort of immediate political conclusions that sounded Marxist, then I want to apply that standard consistently and say that if you're like a corporate diversity consultant, right, you know, like that you're probably not very Marxist. And also, you know, while we're on Judith Butler, like there are public records of this stuff. She was a Kamala Harris donor.
Yeah, that was a bummer, I will say.
I forgot about that.
That was a bummer.
That's tough.
That is tough. Yeah.
I think Judith Butler is a brilliant philosopher. Difficult to read, certainly. And not always the most clear, but that's that's tough on the political front.
Yeah, there is also like, I think, you know, something to be said about the difference in kind between the sort of more overtly political work that she's done since then, her books like Precarious Life and Frames of War, where I worry actually a little bit. I'm not the only one. People have made this critique about the sort of valorization of the status of being precarious is kind of like leaning into neoliberal fragmentation and being like, oh, like, are we atomized and sort of, precarious? Is like, are we precarious? And instead of a materialist analysis that says like, yes, because, the increasing antagonisms or contradictions of capital lead us to have less stability in our actual like lives, is like, no, this is like an ontological status and like it's good actually. It's like, I don't know. This is maybe even like an anti-Marxist line to take, whereas I think that a lot of the stuff about gender performativity is at least compatible,
Right.
obviously not directly Marxist, but plenty of Marxists buy very strongly into the theory of gender performativity. I mean, obviously some don't too, but like there's no immediate contradiction there. Some of the later stuff I think is a little more troubling.
I mean, I think it should be clear that I think for him that what makes them all kind of neo-Marxist is that instead of, again, to go back to the point I was making earlier, instead of class antagonism, you've got just like power antagonism, and that can take the form of like, power of white people over black people, of power over men over women, and everything gets filtered through this lens of like power relations and analyzing power relations. And I don't know, maybe it's worth thinking about why he thinks we shouldn't analyze things. I mean, so look, I obviously am more sympathetic with a Marxist class-oriented view of social contradictions and social antagonisms. But like, why is it so bad, I wonder, in his view, to try to understand the world through like power relationships? Like, bosses have power over workers, and like, it's for him because that's a really, really nefarious thing.
Yeah.
As soon as you start talking about power, that there is power, then
this is part and parcel with the whole of the like the reactionary reply to what you've been calling this sort of like ethical crisis, right? Where like the world is disorderly and chaotic. Order is good. Hierarchy is good, actually. Yeah. Right. And so
that's true. That is the crux.
And so I mean,
power relations, asymmetrical hierarchies asymmetrical power relations for him are like good. They're functionally pragmatic, and it's safer not to undermine them than.
Yeah, exactly. Once you start subjecting them to critical analysis, you risk what? Degenerating back into the great feminine chaos dragon or whatever. And
even though that commits him to the idea that like it's actually good. Like, let's say if like slavery is functionally pragmatic and society just kind of works well and is stable, and like, you can't. Who am I to argue with nature, right? That's his.
Big lobsters dominate little ones, baby.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I mean, this is the point that. So I was on This Is Revolution a while ago. I was talking to Pascal Robert about this, but actually, never mind that. I'm stealing this point from Natalie Wynn, like a old Natalie Wynn video, 2018 on Jordan Peterson. I'd recommend people check out.
That's a classic.
If you haven't watched it, it's a treat, and it is actually, I think, one of the ones where her philosophy training is like really put to good use. Like is because she's actually doing a lot of like, I mean, she's having fun with it, but like she's definitely doing the like taking Peterson's argument slightly more seriously than they deserve thing. And
totally.
She points out in there, I mean, so she's got a great riff about, postmodernism, Marxism, but like also she points out in there that this basic argument that he's making about hierarchies, which is, we just said, right, that because hierarchies are so deeply ingrained in our nature, because they, it goes back to, with what's so deep in our DNA that we have it in common with, lobsters and blah, 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 all that stuff, right? Which is such a weird argument in so many ways, right?
It's so cool. I love it. It's literally like the most absurd version of the naturalistic fallacy possible, right? Like he's not saying that like chimpanzees have hierarchical structures.
I mean, chimpanzees would be so much. I mean, first of all, it would be much more unambiguously true, and secondly, it would be such a better argument because it's
instead he's like these giant clawed sea cockroaches at the bottom of muck feeding at the bottom of the ocean. You're just like them, and it's like what are you? What? And the way that they live is how you should normatively. What are we talking?
I also
about?
just find something more basic and stupid about those arguments really confusing, which is that like if these natural tendencies and natural hierarchies are so intractable, like why aren't they just always prevailing ineluctably?
Nice.
Do you know what I mean? Like why? How are we managing to interrupt? We're so clever as humans that we're actually perturbing and disrupting the whole order of nature.
Right. So the argument is that we're somehow able to perturb them just a little bit,
right?
And that when we do, that's going to lead to chaos and gulags and, you know, et cetera, right? Like all the bad things, you know, cats and dogs living together. And the question,
dogs identifying as cats,
right, we're, you know, it gets so much worse, right? So but the point that Natalie makes about this is that this argument is so general, right? You know, like it's so non-specific to like the specific things he's using it to, like,
for sure,
you know, to object to, that you could, like, a reactionary at any point in human history could just plug in this argument that's like, well, you know, sure. I mean, it could be an antebellum abolitionist talking about masters and slaves. It could be, you know, it could be like a 1790s, you know, monarchist, like objecting to the French Revolution. You know, I mean, it could be, I don't know, like a more hardcore monarchist and, like, you know, whatever that is, like 11th century England objected to the Magna Carta. Like it could be anything.
Yeah, the level of generality is unhelpful, right? It's like, it is, because of its degree of generality, it doesn't pick out anything specific at all. And it makes it look like, if you're like not a careful thinker, that makes it look like, wow, I've got a really good explanatory framework and set of concepts on my hands, because look at all the stuff that it explains. But in fact, this makes it explanatorily useless because it can explain anything. Right?
And anything that explains anything explains nothing, right?
Nothing at all. Right, exactly. Right. Yeah, if your lobster-based natural hierarchy theory is capable of accounting at once for the Magna Carta and, like, postmodern, you know, the character of racial discrimination and, like, you know, the new Jim Crow, well, then I don't know how helpful this is.
And it's also like, I mean, the other thing is, I mean, presumably Jordan Peterson thinks that some of that social progress was good. I mean,
well, this is the cool thing, right? Like, these reactionaries have to, like, on pain of being like too out of touch with like dominant doxa, have to admit that the results of previous progressive movements are good, but they can't allow that, like, the methods or processes by which they were achieved were okay. So, like, this is, and this is also bound up with the sort of way in which they, like, falsify the actual historical record here, either willingly or involuntarily, because they don't know what they're talking about, because none of these people are readers of history, right? But, like, you know, not even an overt reactionary, if they want to have any sort of media credibility, can say, like, well, the civil rights movement was bad, right? And black people shouldn't have gotten it. But you actually can't say that if you want to maintain your sort of credibility in this media environment, this media ecosystem. But you do have to say that, like, either Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement were, like, super nonviolent, and they would have hated socialism, and they would have hated that people notice that there is racism somehow, right? That then, if you notice that there's still racism, you're the real racist. And then, you know, BLM activists today, they're violent. They're, like, you know, they're not doing this right the way that the old good version would have been. So, like, they have to do all these, like, sneaky rhetorical two steps, because even they can't say that, like, it's bad that women can vote and have jobs, right? Even though, you know, by their sort of logic, actually abstract, or, like, you know, taken to,
he comes pretty close sometimes.
He comes pretty close, actually.
He comes pretty close sometimes, especially on the women thing. Like, he doesn't touch
lipstick at work, right? That's the
exactly.
Sexual arousal. Men and women can't work together.
Another funny aspect of that argument is that he, just in terms of trying to understand how he justifies hierarchies in terms of, like, the intractability of nature, because he does, like, it's not like his view of an ideal society is modeled on, like, entirely on nature. Like, for him, like, Great Britain is, for him, like, the paragon of, like, civilization. And there's, like, one of his more recent YouTube videos where he goes to Britain, and he goes around Cambridge and Oxford, and he's getting weepy and no, seriously, he's getting so sentimental, right? By the time he gets into, like, the main hall of Westminster, like in the Parliament building, he's bawling his eyes out, like, at the greatness of, and I'm not exaggerating, right? He's bawling his eyes out at the greatness of like British civilization and everything that was achieved in the creation of, like, Parliament and, like, the People's House. And so that's why, like, there's actually an argument that goes one step further, I think, than just we need to configure society in a way that's commensurate with nature or something.
Mm.
It's that like we have at one point, I guess, sort of created a society that's commensurate with nature and how we're naturally supposed to live, and it's Britain, which is like amazing to think that the UK is the paragon of how we all have to configure our societies in order
But presumably
to be happy.
not the UK now.
No, but I guess it's institutionally, the
Institutionally,
UK's
yeah.
institutions. Yeah.
Yeah. I suppose proof of which is just its longevity, right? Like the institution of the monarchy and of the parliament goes back so long that, wow, this must be a really good bulwark against chaos. Look at how good the ordering has been. I would think would have to be something. Otherwise, I just have no idea for his preference. And I don't know, you watched him cry a lot more than I have. Maybe you have insight.
Which is funny. So, earlier in the chat, Charles Wolford, who's a academic musicologist who I actually did debate about postmodernism a while back, and he's a good guy, but he has, he did make a very, fair point that made me laugh in the chat, which is, before we give Judith Butler too much shit about donating to Kamala Harris, let's remember how much we love Christopher Hitchens on this channel, which is totally fair. But I would say that the specific point about Kamala, about that Judith Butler is that she's whatever she is, she's clearly not a Marxist, and similar points would apply if you're making excuses for the invasion of Iraq. But
yes, no kidding.
But
no war but class war, kids. Don't forget.
Yeah, exactly. But what you were saying was making me think of this. So there's this Christopher Hitchens book, small book pamphlet, that he wrote in 1990 called "The Monarchy: A Critique of Britain's Favorite Fetish," which is really fun for this exact point, right? Because he spends all this time in that book going, like making fun of the idea that the monarchy has historically been a source of stability and going through.
Oh yeah.
The history.
Well, no, like I said, they're either willfully misrepresenting it or they just aren't paying attention to the actual historical record, and I can't tell which it is with these guys, right? Like I don't know if they actually think like the civil rights movement was peaceful, or if they actually think that the monarchy has been a source of stability, or if they're just lying. I can't tell with the case of Peterson.
Yeah, there is a really, yeah, right. So I mean, the how far back question is always really interesting. So I think there's like a episode of Fire in Line where William F. Buckley had on Huey Newton, and Newton.
It's a great episode.
Yeah.
Is challenging him at one point about which side he would have been on in the American Revolution, and Buckley, to his credit, right? I mean, it gives he was such a just a self-aware, uninhibited weirdo about this stuff. Was what actually thinks about it. It's yeah, I don't know. Maybe I would have sided with King George. You're right.
You got to at least respect the intellectual honesty.
Yeah, 100%. I love that. That's great. Yeah.
I said the last time we were talking about this, but man, our reactionaries today, I have to say, they're just significantly dumber than last generation's reactionaries. And I think, Ben, you had a great explanation for that, which is that there was a lot bigger and more potent of a left back then, and so the reactionary thinkers also had to be more on point, more on their game. I've been thinking about that since you said that maybe Jordan Peterson's idiocy and the fact that it still has traction is symptomatic of the fact that, well, we just don't have as consolidated and powerful the left in 2022 as when Buckley was interviewing Huey Newton.
Yeah, right, totally.
Wow.
I'm sorry, we don't where's our Huey Newton, right?
No, totally, right. I mean, Hayek and von Mises were engaging with socialists who, I would point out, were often rooted in analytic philosophy and made good arguments, and B, were actually were confident that they were on the cusp of historical change, and you had to start thinking about the details and logistics of how socialism could work. And they were responding to that, and yeah, I mean, Peterson, the fact that he's responding to this weird, poorly defined mess of any actual Marxism that he detects existed in the world, anything that sort of reminds him of it if you squint just right. And, you know, Ibram X. Kendi and Robin DiAngelo and Kimberly Crenshaw, Bell Hooks, Andrea Dworkin, Naomi Klein, Catherine McKinnon.
By the way, like, wouldn't Peterson have to be on board with Andrea Dworkin and Catherine McKinnon's like anti-pornography position? They're both like anti-pornography, really like sex negative rad femmes who I'm sure he would have like jived with these positions, you know?
Yeah.
I mean, like, I know his good buddy Ben Shapiro would certainly be on board with this stuff, but
I know he's been militating against like promiscuity quite a bit, but I'm not sure. Like, does Peterson talk about pornography? Like, I imagine it's not. He doesn't vibe with it.
I'm trying to remember if I've heard him talk about it. I cannot imagine him saying anything minimally positive.
No.
Yeah, that would be an incredibly weird fit with his views.
Yeah, with everything else we know to be true about this goof.
Yeah. He's just like, oh no, but that's not that bad. You know?
Right. Yeah. No, he can't be on board. But again, like, it's just funny because of like the sort of like, my man just hasn't done his research, right? Like, we made the joke at the beginning, right? It's been 3 years since the Peterson debate, since the Peterson Zizek debate. He's had time to go figure out what he meant. You know, in the moment, he had his moment of head hung in shame, and in the meantime, he's concocted a list of people who have fundamentally incompatible views that are consistent with neither of the two categories that he's applying to them, some of whom he agrees with in spite of himself. So, like, really, just a swish, just a big slam dunk.
Yeah,
it's so cool.
I do think, you know, Gilligan's going a bit, but I do think that just specifically on Derrida, I guess I can't prove this. I strongly suspect that most of what Peterson knows or remembers about Derrida is the titles of his books.
Almost certainly. If anything, yeah.
I mean, I haven't done that deeper research, but I have word searched in his books like Foucault and Derrida, right? Because it seems to me like he has a special spite for the French postmodern neo-Marxists.
Yes.
And he will occasionally say something that vaguely resembles what Foucault was about. You would say, "Oh, everything's about power for Foucault." I mean, yeah, okay, that's true in a sense.
Sure, fine. I'll give it to you.
Yeah, but fine. But then with Derrida, he always just kind of slips it in and says, you know, oh yeah, Derrida is interested in like marginalized people. Derrida didn't write Derrida was interested. He wrote a book called, or he has a book called, what is it, Margins of Philosophy?
Margins of Philosophy, so
yes. Maybe he has, maybe he saw like margins in one of the book titles, but like that's not really Derrida's shtick. I mean, Deacon, especially, you know, he talks a little bit, I guess, about like textual deconstruction, maybe, but I don't know. I think he just kind of slides him in there.
He does just lump him in. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, and I mean, well, right. I also think with, you know, Foucault, what power means there, which again is not often clear, but like, you know, but it is, you know, I think I think the things that word means for Foucault are not necessarily what Peterson is assuming, right? I mean, like, not like in fact is certainly very distant, right, from like thinking primarily in terms of like structural relations of power, in that sense that, you know, would be any kind of Marxism, you know, neo or otherwise, right? And with Derrida, I mean, like, similar to the thing about the margins, I mean, I've heard Peterson make a big deal of the fact that Derrida has a book about Marx, you know, the Spectres of Marx, but like,
which is not about Marx. It's about Hamlet and, you know, this thing called hauntology, which is like ontology. But, you know, because basically what he takes from Marx in that book is that Marx had a line where he says a specter is haunting Europe, and apparently Marx uses the line specter in various different places.
I will defend Derrida a little bit more than Owen's giving him credit for here. We don't need to get into all that right now. It is very funny that he thinks of Derrida as like a straight up, or even like a quote, again, not clear what this means, neo-Marxist, just on the basis of having
him a barely repentant Marxist.
A barely repentant Marxist. It's a completely ridiculous thing to say. I've been convinced by conversations with people who work on Derrida that there's there's value in that book, that it is worth taking seriously. Maybe not as
I wasn't denying that there was a value. I just don't think it's a book about Marxism or Marx really that much.
I mean, whether or not there's value in it, as far as I could tell, like what he actually takes from Marx in that book is like, oh, there's some kind of critical spirit there. That's nice.
There's a good critical spirit, and it has something to do with how we relate to the future in the form of the projects that we're undertaking. And like, yeah, that's interesting. Sure, we can try to elaborate that in greater detail. But yeah, to your point, Ben, I wanted to just kind of agree with you, because Owen and I have had this conversation about Foucault. I think the first time we had this conversation about Foucault, Owen, was like 10 years ago, where we were like, it actually is really weird that how incompatible these two concepts of power are that we get in the Marxian tradition, which is about like specific action of structures organized hierarchically in order to dominate. And Foucault's trying to work out like a concept of power that is specifically not that, right? Which is very diffuse, which is sort of operative at like this weird micrological level, where like power is involved in, I hate giving the reactionaries anything, but like this is where you end up with a concept like microaggression, to be quick about it, right? And like that's actually pretty incompatible, or it's super unclear how you would make it compatible with an idea of like class antagonism as like a fundamental structuring feature of a society.
I mean, I see power, this like quite simply, and this doesn't cover everything Foucault ever says about power, but I see power in Foucault as just forces that determine conduct. Like power is like a force that determines conduct. And so like, I think Foucault did a great service to social analysis by doing what he calls like the microphysics of power. I'll go right down to like how a classroom is laid out, how a prison is configured and constructed, how different elements of like surveillance, examination, medicalization, and right down to like what's happening at the site of like the architecture of like a room or a hallway or whatever. Like, I think there's real value in that, and I think it's like those are all different sites at which our conduct is being shaped in different ways, right? Our conduct does get shaped when we're in school, gets shaped when we're in processes of medicalization and medical treatment or whatever, right? But I don't know. I guess like I don't see how. I don't know. Maybe I don't see the connection between that microphysics and like the microaggression thing. Maybe that's unfair to Foucault.
Well, it's definitely quick. Yeah, sorry.
I mean, maybe not, right? I mean, I think that's what I'm saying about it's a little ambiguous, what some of these things mean, right? To the extent that that the power is not just an eccentric word choice for like things that shape us, but I mean that like some of the normal connotations of power are, like meant to at least be suggested by that, like his use of that term, right? Then I can see the microaggression thing a little bit more, right? Because you're saying that like power in some sort of political sense that we're worried about is super duper diffuse, etc. And like I could maybe see how that would go.
Yeah, that's true, and that's one of the like Marxist critiques of the Foucauldian concept of power, that if it's so diffuse, our conduct is being determined from so many different directions and at every different level. Like, how do you actually ever oppose that? And like, who opposes it and with what means? And, if power is everywhere, then he also says there's resistance everywhere. And then
a notion I despise.
Exactly. I don't like that idea. And so then it gets really hard to figure out that what is actually, organized countervailing power against dominant power structures. What does that look like? And that there, I think Foucault's not helpful really. So
yeah. Well, anyways, I mean, all of that like just makes me think of there's this great clip that when I was co-hosted Dead Pundit Society, we listened to this in like the first or second episode, and of Michael Albert actually, who is in this very sort of like wary old activist kind of mode, right? Is making fun of the phrase "fighting the good fight," and he's like, "Look, I mean, if you're just fighting to fight, why bother? I mean, just go to the beach or something. Like, why are you, why would you do this with
That's
your life,
true.
Right?
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, if we just sort of have like eternal power and eternal resistance, it's like I don't really know why that's something that I'm going to like particularly focus my energy on worrying about. Again, at least if these terms are being used in anything like their normal meaning.
That's why it's really funny that they even lump that stuff in with the left. I mean, I think you can put Foucault to interesting and important uses, like as a leftist thinker or practitioner, but there is no, I don't think, immediate affinity between like someone like Foucault or like Derrida or even Judith Butler and like left anti-capitalism or anti-structural social movements. Like I just it's a very strained connection. At least I've tried to make it before, but it's a strained connection.
I think that there's specifically value, as we mentioned before, the work that he did in the 70s. Like is like historically useful stuff to know and to think about, right? And like for the purposes of people who are interested in capitalism and its legacy, like what are the sort of roots of this thing that we call the prison industrial complex, and like how to understand carcerality. Like, yeah, there's a whole hell of a lot there. We would not be where we are thinking about this stuff today if it weren't for Foucault. But like, still got to be a Marxist though, right, dog? I don't know.
Yeah, I will just say the thing that I find useful with Foucault from that period, right, is that he doesn't really offer an explanation of like economic relations of production or mode of production, but he can tell you a good story about the forms of governmental power that are necessary, that grew up with those economic systems, and that are actually in some ways pretty necessary for allowing them to reproduce themselves over, in a stable way over time, right? There's a governmental logic. He calls it disciplinary power. Sometimes he calls it, later, like security, the logic of security or whatever. But there has to be a governmental structure that is, there was a governmental structure, an operation of power on the workplace, right? In the streets, with to deal with like how you manage poor people, all of that, right? Like that's all part of the story. But so that's why I think, yeah, Gil, you're right. That period, I think, of his work is extremely useful for a kind of Marxist analysis of history. But it isn't Marxist. It isn't Marxist.
Yeah, right. He's making points that can be, very relevant for like figuring that out. But the analytic framework certainly isn't a Marxist analytic framework, and and the sort of political valence of it just doesn't seem like, look, if you have, again, unless you just think these are like really weird word choices and none of this really has anything to do with politics, like if you just have super duper diffuse power and super duper diffuse resistance, then like, you could have your small acts of, resistance and, sabotage and orgies and whatever until the end of time. But like, you're certainly no concept of, I don't know, like actually achieve, having some sort of strategy by which you achieve some sort of reasonably just society, and then like you figure out how to actually organize it. And, presumably this is just, this is just like all, power is just, reconstituted itself again. Like,
right.
So like, it's really, at that point, it's like really hard to like, get it up if, in terms of your enthusiasm for that, that project. So I think it's both, analytically not Marxist, and it's just like politically, it seems incredibly unhelpful to me, which is not to say that people shouldn't read those books, or not to say that you're not going to get some like really insightful things from those. You actually are, right? But like, I don't think he's sitting on the nexus between Marxism and anything.
There's I think that point is right, though, that the analytical utility of Foucault, I think, is like pretty enormous in some ways, but I think the practical utility is, maybe just non-existent as far as the kinds of practice that we're discussing or interested in.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah. All right, guys. I think Angela Davis, postmodernist.
No. Good word.
Okay.
No.
All right.
Yeah. Don't think so.
Don't think so.
Because that was thrown in after the original tweet.
She did write. Well, she did write her dissertation on the original postmodernist Immanuel Kant.
Oh, that's true.
Oh, that's right. We didn't even touch on that yet. That this week, Kant has been thrown into this whole like cultural debate.
The original critical theorist.
Yeah, in the confirmation debate. In the confirmation hearings.
Oh yeah,
for Ketanji Brown Jackson. that's where someone, I guess, testified that, critical race theory actually goes all the way back to Kant, and we need this, this nominee to be on the Supreme Court to like basically disavow CRT, or she's basically endorsing Kant, who's like the original postmodern neo-Marxist, like,
So
effectively.
So sick. I for one would like a Supreme Court justice who understands that we do not have epistemic access to the thing in itself, but we can have a transcendental deduction of the a priori categories of the understanding, right? So like that would be cool, I think. But Kant was hella racist, like one of the most racist dudes.
And also you read what Kant thought about the relations between masters and servants. I just don't think that there's I just don't think that that's that Marxist either, frankly.
I'm gonna go out on a limb.
For me, isn't that Kant, the moment where we just realize the coherence of this? There's something else going on here that has nothing to do with the content of any of these thinkers, because Kant's noted racist and Enlightenment enthusiast is now being like held up in Congress as the anti-racist, or the OG anti-racist, anti-Enlightenment guy. It's incredible.
Something's going on.
Okay. So I have a new theory about this, which is that the nexus of postmodernism and Marxism is when you read books.
Ooh.
Yeah, that could be it. Yeah,
that seems right. It seems right. And as someone who, in spite of himself, has spent time reading books, I can tell you that it feels pretty bad at the nexus. Okay, it's pretty depressing here.
The final irony will be that like we'll be the last ones left being like, no, there's actually some interesting things in like Hobbes and Locke and what you used to call like the Western tradition. No, that's all precursors to postmodern neo-Marxism, and that's basically all leading to
the critical theory starts with the allegory of the cave. So
absolutely. Well, I mean, 100%. Hobbes himself said that the sovereign needs to define words. It is part of their purview, and they're going to tell us what words mean. You mean words don't just mean things that the sovereign decides?
Basically, the sovereign told you
he's a postmodernist.
Yeah. Basically, Hobbes. The Hobbesian sovereign says, that you have to have the pronouns you use dictated to you from on high. that's that's where it all started.
All right. Well, in 2025, when he puts out the revised list, we'll have to do this again.
Thanks for having us on, Ben.
Yeah, thank you, Ben.
You have been watching free public content from Give Them an Argument. To access every single episode of the show, the main show on Monday nights, all of the streams, all of the debate breakdowns, all of the patron-exclusive post-games on Monday nights, all of the patron-exclusive bonus episodes every week, and much, much more, go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis. I cannot resist ending this with, don't be foolish.